So now let's talk about measuring the dependent variable. So one thing you want to think about when you're trying to decide on a dependent variable is you want to make sure that your dependent variable is going to be sensitive to the manipulation. In other words, that it can have the independent variable can have an effect on it. So let's say, for example, we're trying to measure academic performance, but we make the test that we're trying to use as our assessment of performance too easy, so that regardless of what condition they're in, they all ace the test. Or you make it too hard, where like regardless of what condition they're in, everybody fails the test. Those aren't helpful because what you want to have is a lot of variability on your dependent variable. You want it to have some people do well, some people do poorly, and you want the differences between the people who did well and the people who did poorly to be the result of your manipulation. So you want one group as a collective to do better than the other group. The problem is if the test is too easy, everyone will do well regardless of what condition they're in. So you want to avoid that. So you want to avoid what's called ceiling effects, where everything's too easy, or floor effects, where the measure of the dependent variable is too hard, right? And one way to determine whether or not your dependent variable is going to be sensitive to the manipulation of the independent variable is by having what's called a pilot test. When you run a small subset of individuals through your study to get a sense of, is your manipulation working? Are people, one, are they buying the manipulation that you're telling them? Is your independent variable a good manipulation? Is your dependent variable one that's going to be sensitive to that manipulation? You also want to think about having more than one way of measuring your dependent variable. Because sometimes if you only have one way, that might be problematic. You want to have multiple measures of the dependent variable. This goes back to the idea of conceptual variables, right? So you may have a conceptual variable, if you only measure it one way, it may only tap into some smaller component of that conceptual variable. You want to have multiple ways that get at various components of that conceptual variable. With the idea being, if the independent variable has the same effect on all of those dependent variables, then that would suggest that the independent variable is really having an effect on the conceptual dependent variable of interest. That being said, it's important to put the dependent variable that you care about the most first, because you want to make sure that there's nothing happening in between your manipulation of the independent variable and your measurement of your important dependent variable. So you wouldn't want to have other variables in between them, because they may weaken the effect of the independent variable on your dependent variable. And you don't want to have a long gap in time between when you manipulate the independent variable and when you measure the dependent variable, because that time might also weaken the effect of that independent variable. Next, we want to control for expectations. So this is when you're trying to control for the expectations of the participants, so that things those expectations don't influence their behavior, right? So this goes back to our idea of demand characteristics, where there are things in the environment that might get people to either expect that the researcher wants them to act a certain way, or give them cues on what the researcher's hypothesis is. One way to address some of these demand characteristics is by giving people a placebo. So if you're giving them some kind of a pill or a medicine, you can give them a placebo. And the placebo, participants think they're getting the actual drug that has the drug in it, but they're getting a pill that doesn't have the drug in it. And the idea being, if sometimes people will respond to the drug not because the drug is having an effect, but because they think the drug is going to have an effect. So if you give some people the actual drug and some people a placebo, you can now disentangle the actual effect of the drug from people's expectation of what the drug is going to do. So if the people who get the actual drug and the people who get the placebo, if their response is the same on the dependent variable, then that would suggest that whatever effects you're seeing are due to people's expectation of how the drug is going to affect them. What you want to be able to show is that the people who got the actual drug have different effects than the people who got the placebo. Because that would suggest that it's not simply people's expectation of what the drug is going to do, but the actual effect of the drug itself. Another way that you can manage people's expectations is by deceiving them. We talked about this when we talked about ethics, right? So you might tell them the study is about one thing, but in reality it's about something else, right? So Milgram's study is a good example of that, where his he told the participants that the study was about learning styles and stuff like that, but in reality it was about conformity. So he gave them what's called a cover story, which is a false or misleading statement about what the study is about, with the idea being they might act unnaturally in regards to what the cover story tells them the study is about. So they might have certain expectations in regards to their cover story explanation, but they might not have any expectations, and they might act more naturally in regard to what the study actually is measuring. So it's kind of like throwing them off the scent a little bit, so they'll act naturally in regards to what the study is really about. Because for him, the study was really about conformity, right? But if he told them it was about conformity, they wouldn't conform. So he tells them it's about learning styles, and then they feel much more comfortable conforming and to authority when they're given the opportunity, because they didn't think the study was about conforming to authority figures. And again, if a placebo is another way in which you can manage people's expectations. You also have to think about managing the expectations of the person who's actually administering the study, right? So you might have like a undergraduate research assistant who's administering the study, and they might say or do things that might get the participants to act in ways that are in line with the study's hypotheses. One way to avoid the person who's administering the study from doing things that might influence the results is by keeping them blind to the study as well. So they don't know what condition people are in. Oftentimes, they won't even know exactly what the study is about. So when that happens, there's no way for them to either consciously or unconsciously do things to get the participants to act in line with the study's hypotheses. And when the experimenter doesn't know what condition the participants are in, that's what's called a double-blind experiment. And that's very important when you're doing medical research. You don't want the person who's administering the drug to know what the study is about or what condition the participants are in. And obviously, you don't want the participants to know what condition they're in. So if both the participant and the experimenter are blind to what's going on, that's a double-blind experiment, and that leads to the greatest chance of you being able to get reliable, valid results. And the last thing we have to think about are some additional considerations that don't fall within these other four. So one thing you want to do at the end of the study is to confirm that participants actually got the manipulation, right? So if you told participants that they got negative, if you gave them negative feedback in one condition and positive feedback in a different condition, you want to make sure that at the end of the study that they felt like they got either the negative feedback or the positive feedback. Because you want to ensure that everyone in the negative feedback condition had that experience of getting negative feedback. If some people were like, oh, they were in the negative feedback condition, but they were like, oh, I got great feedback, that's problematic because they're supposed to have thought that they got negative feedback. So when people fail manipulation checks like that, those are people you're going to want to exclude from your study because they did not either recognize or respond to the manipulation in the way that's expected. And it'll throw off your results. So, but you want to identify those people because maybe they weren't really focused on your study. And that's oftentimes true of like online studies. People are kind of going through it really fast and they're not really reading anything. They're just filling in answers. So those people who fail the manipulation checks are probably the ones that you don't want to have in your study in the first place. So it helps you figure out why you didn't get your hypothesized results, because maybe people just failed the check and therefore you needed to like redo your manipulation so that it's clear what the participants were, what condition they were in, and also helps you identify people who you need to exclude because they weren't paying enough attention and they failed those manipulation checks. And as we talked about a little bit earlier, you might want to run a pilot study or do some pilot testing to make sure that your study materials are good. So you want to make sure you run a smaller study on, like, let's say 15, 20 people to make sure that, one, people are passing the manipulation checks, that people are able to understand the instructions, that your dependent variable is sensitive to the manipulation. All these things you want to do ahead of time in this smaller pilot study to ensure that when you run the full-blown study, that you give yourself the best chance of getting your hypothesized results. You also want to make sure that at the end of the study, if you use any deception, that you debrief them. This goes back to our discussion about ethics. You can't have people walk away not understanding that they've been deceived and being informed about why they were deceived and what the true state of affairs are. So it's very important that if you use any type of deception, that you debrief them about the nature of that deception. And that would definitely be something that the IRB would be checking to make sure that you're doing in your study.